This afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about the value of communications, and then we're going to go on and talk just a little bit around the future technology and credit collections as the last session for the day. But for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about value of communications. And on the stage with me for this session, we've got Rachael Magowan, who's from Moneyline. Rachel, I don't know if you wanted to come and join us. Alasdair Skeoch, who's from Everyday People, BPO Collections. Dan Walker, who's a co-founder for AI for Business, and Puja Rohra from CreditSpring. So welcome to on the stage. And I suppose, again, we just kind of looked a little bit around what are some of the history that we've kind of seen over the last year, and some of the topics that have come up. Topic around value communications have been around things like clear, jargon-free, outcome-focused kind of discussion, digital journeys. So are you rushing digital journeys, or do we need to have more positive friction when we're talking with customers? Personalization, omni-channel engagement, making sure we're being proactive, behavioral science, which we talked a little bit about this morning, and making sure we have good transparency. So those are some of the themes that have come up in the industry discussions up to now. And I suppose, to start off, I suppose, I wanted to start off by thinking a little bit about how do we get in the mindset of customers and using that in terms of like engaging them. So what are some of the things you think we've got to think about in terms of getting into the mindset of customers and working out how to engage them to really find out about their support options? I mean, Rachel, maybe you've got to go first on that.
Sorry, it's working. Yeah, thank you. So I think for us at Moneyline, we're a social impact personal lender. So we provide small cash loans to the lowest 20% of income earners across the UK. So we start our business from a position that every customer that lands on our doorstep is vulnerable. And every policy and every process is written from that stance. So I think for us, when we look at how we look at customer mindset, we've had customer first in our organisation for 7 years, and we've also had a customer first manager appointed, and that customer first manager for us is absolutely there to hold the mirror up to us right across the organisation, and is absolutely key to being the customer voice and how she engages with our customers to understand how they're feeling at the different parts of our journey. So it's a real advocate, an internal advocate for our customer, for us, and understanding their mindset. We do, as I'm sure most people do in here, we map customer journeys, but it's really difficult, I think, when you look at your customer journeys, because probably all four of us would land in exactly the same situation, would feel very differently, depending on lots of different factors. So customer journeys can't just be one-dimensional, and we need to understand how we do it is we look at the personas in our target audience and how that persona would potentially feel and what that mindset would be to help how we design our customer journeys. So I think it's not just one thing, and I think if somebody says, we've just got a bit of analytics or a bit of data and we don't consider any of the customer mindset or behaviours, you often will go down a rabbit hole and you'll lose a lot of that insight to be able to engage.
Yeah, I mean, Puja, what do you kind of think in terms of like what are the triggers, I suppose, or the connections we've got to make with customers, particularly in financial difficulties, to really get them to engage, to communicate with them?
I agree with Rachel. Firstly, it's very important to understand customer journeys and where customers are coming from. We have put in a lot of time to survey customers, talk to them, understand what is driving their behavior. A lot of the customers that come to us are in financial distress. And while data can help understand patterns and what customers are doing, mindsets help us understand why they're doing it. Some of the mindsets that we've seen, for example, is when customers are stressed, they like to avoid situations, so they might not respond to communication. Or let's say they have a short-term bias, where they're focused more on what they're doing today, as opposed to what would the repercussions of that action will be tomorrow. So these are some examples of customer mindsets that we sort of understand, and then we figure out how can we use communications to reach out to those customers, use data to intervene at the right time with the right channel and the right approach.
Yeah. And does that, like the customer stress and sort of like, does that lead to things like, I mean, often you get certain behaviours that happen when they're in stress and sort of behavioural biases that happen in stress. I mean, does that lead to certain people making like suboptimal decisions or those kind of things? Is that sort of things we've got to think about? Do you want to comment on that, or Alasdair?
Well, from our perspective, we're in debt recovery. The accounts are long past due by the time they reach us. So our customer base probably falls into two groups. There's a group that have no intention or ability to engage, and that's a different issue altogether. But those customers that do engage all generally want the same thing, and they want a resolution. Now, that resolution might not always be paying the account in full, but that's what they want. And as long as we all start with that same mindset, similar to Rachael, about 40% of the customers that we engage with will have at least one vulnerable situation they're dealing with now, and the average is about 3. Some of those will be a prohibitor to payment, some won't. So you've got to make sure that your communication brings that to bear. And I think the other interesting thing is how you communicate with those customers that want a very quick, simple resolution and can self-serve and do that, and then change and pivot to deal with those customers that will wish to speak to us. The majority of our customers self-serve, but those that do speak to us usually have the most challenging story, and they have got the biggest barrier to getting the resolution. They either don't understand the range of resolutions that are open to them, or just need the comfort that they're not alone in the situation that they're in.
And what's the role of like the language or the tone and manner of the communication in terms of speaking to those different cohorts?
So I think it starts with the written communication. Interestingly, we just closed an office recently, and within that office had been occupied for 30 years, and we found some of the letter sets that we used in days gone by, and it really brought home to me how the tone and the approach and the colours and the way that letters look. Letters now don't really look like letters. They look like a printed web page almost. So I think you've got to try and make sure those communications are as clear as they possibly can be. Reduce the reading age. Take away as much of the formality as possible to make it very clear what the customer can do. And also be mindful that certain parts of that letter, much like a web page, will attract a response from customers. So keep the language simple. We have an average reading age in the communications that we use of 11. So try and keep it very simple, and be as mindful as you can for those that are neurodivergent or would have other particular language barriers, that you keep everything as easily as understood for the widest group of people as you possibly can.
And Dan, I suppose, I know you come from an AI perspective in particular, some of your background. Where does technology help us sort of, suppose, change that messaging in terms of for different types of people? So Alasdair, you just talked about average reading age of 11. That's an average. Some people might be lower. Some people might indeed be higher as well. I mean, where does technology increasingly play a part in terms of like customizing that?
So yeah, you can segment and you can make sure that certain demographics are being communicated to the highest ability for their needs. A couple of implementations that we've done, we've ensured that the customer base is first and foremost protected. So if they wish to be communicated to in a certain way, or there's information that they require in a certain style of information that they need, to make sure that their needs are catered to. They should all, if you're end user, if you're developing and deploying some sort of AI technology in the communication background, your end user is key, and their buy-in and their understanding of it is first and foremost important. So
yeah, and I suppose that's the content of the communication, but we also have then channels of communication. And historically we talked a lot about digital communications versus telephony. I mean, going back to the old print sets of probably black and white letters, official letters, and those kind of things, which is with stamps on as well. The mailing machine.
Some of us are not old enough to understand what that is. I don't know.
I definitely am. So the franking machine in the office. Yeah. What channels do we need to concentrate on now, and how do we get that channel mix right? Where's that kind of evolved to? Because definitely it felt like over this last couple of years, we're very much looking around digital. The data I see still seems that telephone hasn't gone away. In fact, you have to cater for everything. But I mean, what channels are you seeing as sort of like customers preferring? I mean, Rachel, maybe start.
Yeah, no, I agree, and we're an omni-channel organisation, and what's really important to us is that customers can move between those channels at a time when they feel they want to move between those channels. So AI is really helpful in that, in terms of being able to very quickly update notes on an account if it's started in an app chat, for example, and then it goes straight into an email and across into the telephony. I think what's key is that not all organisations will be able to offer that, and where you can't, how do you then create an opportunity for a customer to be able to engage with you in a way that's relevant for them? I think for us, it's really important because as we do some of our customer journey map, and we know that there's certain points or there's certain personas where customers will choose not to speak to us, and generally that is because they would prefer to not be judged by somebody on the end of a telephone, so therefore they might choose to engage with us through our app or through email or WhatsApp, SMS. So for us it's really important, but it's really important that we allow the customer to drive through those different channels depending on where they are, and I think that also is not a one-stop shop either. You might onboard a customer that actually has a preferred channel of communication, but that changes when they reach certain milestones in your in-life management. So if I have a missed payment, my preferred payment or my preferred channel may not be what it was when I first onboarded with you. So it's got to be a really evolutionary process, and that's how we do it at Moneyline.
And how do you get the balance right? I mean, Alasdair, how do you get the balance right in terms of what to start with? I mean, you're talking about starting with letter as an example versus is it one size fits all, or does it get more complex than that, do you think?
No, we generally use the data that our client will hold to determine what the channel of choice will be in the first instance, and sometimes that will be mandated by the client. In terms of the range of channels, I remember about 18 months ago, HMRC made an announcement. They still had 300,000 customers at that point were automatically getting paper-based annual tax returns, and they made a unilateral decision to stop sending paper-based tax returns. And they made the decision partly probably because of cost, but they explained they made the decision because access to digital channels was no longer a restriction based on age. It had been, that was the biggest reason, the biggest barrier to people using digital channels was age, but by this point, 18 months ago, HMRC believed that that was no longer the case. I'm 57. When I was at school, we had computers, right? And I wasn't at school yesterday, wasn't at school the day before yesterday, so that was a long time ago. So most of the people that we deal with will have some access in some way, shape or form. The idea that they'll be digitally excluded because they don't have access to necessarily broadband. They may no longer have the mobile phone that we're asking them to pay for, but it won't be based on capacity to use digital channels. That said, the broader the channels you have, I believe the greater the spectrum you'll cover and the more people you'll engage with. And I also think what's quite key, because we're at the crunch end of the credit cycle really, is that customers who were quite happy users of technology when everything was going swimmingly, when things tend not to go as well, want the comfort sometimes of speaking to somebody about their problem. And we've probably all experienced that. We're happy to use the app. The minute the thing doesn't arrive, we try a couple of times to use the web chat, get frustrated and think, we kind of lift the phone. So we still see a bit of that. The challenge around, I mentioned earlier on, about 40% of our customers having at least one vulnerability they're dealing with right now, and the average of 3. It's difficult to evidence you can harvest that information if a consumer is only using digital channels. So we tend to get the majority of that information gleaned from the telephone conversations we have with customers, so we know that. It's more challenging to know where somebody has gone online, completed an I&E digitally with open banking and all the fun of the fair that brings you, but how do you then know that that customer has got some of the vulnerabilities that we should really know about in order to make sure we manage their account accordingly?
So it sounds like it's having that full suite of communication channels is quite important, so you can sort of mix and match and people can choose what they want rather than sort of narrowing down to a couple of the most successful.
Absolutely. And I also think it's interesting that I don't think post is dead. It's dead expensive, but I don't think it's dead. And I use, well, we all tend to use our own examples in life, don't we? My 15-year-old son got a letter the other day. He would have been bombarded that day with digital stuff from all the things he does. But the letter, he went straight to that letter and opened it. So I think sometimes when you step out the channel of normality, when you're trying to do the work that we're doing, which is re-engage with customers that maybe haven't engaged, stepping out a channel is also as important as staying in the channel.
I went to a marketing conference earlier in the year, and there was a lot of talk about the resurgence of direct mail, because that was because of it, because you don't get it as much, but now it becomes unusual, so it becomes a thing to stand out.
Absolutely. Last year, had it not been for Rishi Sunak standing out in the rain, telling us he was going to have an election, I would have come home for the first holiday ever with no post. But because of a postal vote, there was a postal voting paper there. That was the only piece of post I would have had. Think about that if you're trying to draw yourself attention. You used to have to fight through a pile of post. Now, if there's very little else there, it's a bit easier to stand out.
Yeah. Puja, what do you kind of think in terms of that, having the range of channels? I mean, are there any new channels you think we've got to look out for? I mean, we're looking around that standing out. Having a new channel is a good way of sort of like standing out to a certain extent, or even using old channels. What were your thoughts around that?
Firstly, I agree with everyone about direct mail. We of course, use it for customers who do need it. But in this day of digital, where everybody is constantly being bombarded with so many digital communication, direct mail does stand out. Direct mail is something that we've been using. But apart from that, having an omni-channel strategy really helps. It's also a balancing act. There are certain channels that work better and customers would prefer, let's say telephone or direct mail, but there's also cost involved. So we constantly have to figure out what's the right balance between, let's say emails might be the most effective and cost-friendly, but only emails will not do the trick. So how do you find the right balance between emails, SMS, direct mail, as well as online ads, online channels? I drive marketing, so we do customer support. We take care of customers when they need payment support, but we also reach out to potential customers and try to tell them about the product. There's a whole mix of social media channels, ads, Google search, SEO, and in this day of AI, there's GEO, which is Gen AI optimization. People are now searching on ChatGPT and Gemini. So we have to keep evolving with time. There are new channels that are coming up. The idea is that how do you constantly test, learn, and see what works for your product and for your customers. Also, there are different segments of customers for whom different channels work. So if I'm trying to acquire customers or reach out and take my message, I'll have a segment that is much younger. They'll probably react to reels or posts that are slightly subtle or savvy or witty. I'll have an older set of customers who'll prefer phone calls or direct mail. So it's very important to balance segments, personas, as well as cost when planning a channel strategy.
That's also all complexity, and I suppose, Dan, the question is really around how do we manage that complexity? Obviously, AI is a way of sort of managing that complexity, but what are some of the things we've got to think about? And like we were just chatting around at lunchtime around what safeguards we've got to put in as well when we're managing huge amounts of complexity using machines.
Yeah, if you use it wisely, then it's a powerful tool. Similar to you mentioned marketing, simply having an opt-in, opt-out option of how the customer wishes to be communicated to, but offering that every 3 months to work out what channel they prefer to be communicated by. So they might have changed their preferences, and we've got to safeguard the customer over their preference. Similar to marketing, you can market, opt-in, opt-out, but more fundamentally, you can use some, technology, AI, to start to assess and analyze the data that it comes from. So if your customer is going through a life cycle of payment, but then there's one channel that's working every time, if you're doing it manually and you're not, there's big, large data sets, you can see how that customer has gone from 15 days late to 30 days late, but then there's different channels that you can use technology to learn from this. So knowing that email 1 didn't work, but then letter 2 did, you might start to adjust your collection strategy accordingly based on the results you can see. But it's a two-way process. You're communicating to the customer, and the customer's communicating to you. So you've got to learn from their behaviors, how they wish to be communicated to, and fundamentally, if you are using technology, you've got to offer that input from them, how they wish to be communicated to. So some interesting demographics could be that we did a study on Klarna recently, and the net promoters of the AI chatbot that they introduced, the customer service chatbot, was the 25 to 30-year-olds. And the biggest net detractors were actually the 31 to 5-year-olds. So in between such a short demographic, there was a huge spike either side of net promoters and net detractors. So you've got to learn from this. You've got to offer the customer's input and accordingly look at how you can communicate with them to be successful as a business in collect, but also offer a service to the customer.
And do you think there's an overlay between just that particular statistic between younger and slightly older, also in terms of like stage where they are in their debt life cycle? I'm just going back to what you were saying, Alasdair, there around sort of like when people tend to have problems. You know, they're a little bit older, they tend to have problems because they've got more outgoings, those kind of things. I mean, it's like, so we have to react. Do you think that's an element, and do we have to sort of react to that?
Well, from some of the implementations that we've done, just to refer to say that again, Sammy, just
so when you get into sort of like middle age, you have more outgoings, so you have family, you have kids, those kind of things. So usually there's more financial stress on you.
Yeah.
When you're younger, you have less financial stress on you, and so typically you'll have more complex collections conversations if you're in sort of like middle age, where you sort of got more stress than if you're younger, young, free, and single, let's say. So those kind of things. So that might be a change. I mean, Alice, I mean, I'm kind of interested just to, I'll let you come back and answer, but do you think that's the case? I mean, do you agree with me, or do you think that could be part of it, or do we have to be sensitive to it?
I wonder if age is not the biggest group that covers that scenario you're talking about. And we have an advantage in the world that we're in, where we will see the same customer across many clients. And if we were to group them in that way, there'd be a significant proportion of them who would be grouped differently based on the data that we've received initially from the client, because tenure with the client, size of balance, level of arrears, whatever it might be, their behaviours would be different. So suppose it comes back to star signs. I mean, star signs, if you believe in that nonsense, but that doesn't describe 1/12 of the world, does it? Really, you know, that can't be all Sagittarius right there. That's not all their characteristics. Some of those will change, and I think they will change as you go through the life cycle of the account. I would imagine your channel of choice will change, how you want to resolve the problem will change, what you respond to will change, because circumstances have changed.
Yeah, but I suppose but coming back to that, maybe it's the using AI to manage the complexity around communication and understanding those different segments.
It's large data sets, yeah. So you've got fundamentally a whole bunch of information, labeled data, you know, data that you can feed from, and it's about being clever about how you use it, and just make sure that you're opening the correct channels of communication at the right time. And like you said, the preference might change through the life cycle of their collections. So someone might, you know, you could do analysis on when someone's likely to give an I&E. You know, are they going to give you an I&E early in the collection cycle, or is it later on when they're in more financial difficulty? So it's, you know, it's behavioural stuff, it's communication, learning when customers are communicating back to you and giving you valuable information. But if you're a credit controller or debt collector that's got, you know, a portfolio of 200 customers, it's quite hard to keep up with understanding if Jill likes to be communicated in a certain way on a certain day. But when you've got something that's able to analyse that in more depth and prompt the human, so say you're most likely to be successful if you pick up the phone and speak to this person today. It's learned that on, you know, if they're ever late on day 15, maybe it's their payday, maybe it references to something like that. If you call them and have a good conversation at 10 o'clock, they're likely to pick up the phone. So it's just learning from the data. And
when we're communicating with customers, how do we make the difference, understand the difference between, I suppose, stated preferences, and we talked about preferences already, which is quite easy, because it's like, I want to be called, or I want to have it, versus almost like implied or inferred preferences, which is actually probably what the right thing is to do. I mean, is that a balance where we've got to think about that? And it's probably in the data, but how do we sort of navigate to that point to offer the right solutions? It might not be what they're asking for, but it might be the right solution for them.
It needs to be human-led. So you can be prompted and offered, you know, if you're suggested something on that day, but you can have preference over it. So you can check back in your custom notes or get a feeling from a conversation. You might have a different outlook. So I think it's a blend between being prompted and suggested, and then human oversight and human in the loop decision making.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, what's your kind of view on that in terms of like how to understand that? I mean, do you guys sort of just look at preferences? Or do you look at what should, or preferences or expressed need for support? Do you look at also what the implied piece is, or is that just part of the conversation?
Probably similar. We'll look at supply, so what is the preferred, but also we'll look at their history of contact with us. So what does that historical contact look like? And do they contact us at certain times of the day? How do they choose to contact us? So one of the things that we've seen quite a lot this year, which is quite a significant shift in customer behaviour and mindset, is that if I don't immediately get what I need from you, I'm going to try every single channel I possibly can. So I've seen calls come into our telephony, and if I'm in the queue longer than a couple of minutes, I'm then firing an email to you, and then I'm sending you an SMS, and then I'm doing all of these things. But for us, when we look at that proactive outbound contact strategy, it's what is the preferred, how have you contacted us previously, and then how do we, also we've got our agents that will have had conversations, and what does that tell us as well through that conversation that we've had with that customer previously. So you can't just do one, it's got to be a 2 or 3 strings that you come together, and then that should give you an overarching strategy.
I mean, all we talk about extra channels, but all these extra channels add complexity and actually cost to actually manage those. I think there's an airline that was out there that sort of like cut back down to only like 3 channels, I think it was, and it was like really sort of cut that back. Is there an argument to do that if it covers everyone? I mean, Puja, what do you kind of think? Or is it just better? More is better? More is better?
I think with the data and tech that we have, we're not afraid of managing complexity. We got to do what helps the customers, what helps the business. I agree that at times, let's say if we're implementing a new solution, let's say I have a new persona segmentation where I'm trying to figure out if this works. Yes, I'm going to start with 1 or 2 channels. I'm not going to start a new strategy or a test with multiple channels. But once it works, I will figure out if a multi-channel approach will make it more effective. So I think that there is merit in reducing complexity when we are trying to test and learn. But when we've established and validated a hypothesis, I think it's very important to bring in the complexity, because in this day, people want options. They want to be communicated via various channels. They are present at various mediums now, and different channels serve different purpose. It's difficult to replace phone calls with emails at time, because there are certain customers, let's say vulnerable customers, who might need that extra human touch. So we will have to provide that, whether it's through phone calls or it's through in-person meetings. So it's difficult to say that we can completely remove all channels. It depends on the persona, the segment, and the situation.
Yeah, okay.
I think you could achieve that, but you've just got to be really careful in terms of where your dropout points are, and then what is the support that's in place to do that. So if you do restrict your channels, then just making sure that wherever you create that friction, that there is a human at the end of a phone, if that's what the customer wants. But you may not choose to have an open inbound telephony system, but you might have that as a fallback option if that's what your journey.
So it's like having the secret telephone number that isn't on the website.
No, I would absolutely not ever condone that.
But I think also, Chris, it's interesting that it was an airline who made that change. Steve Preston and I were talking about something similar earlier on. Adding a channel can be tough. Retiring a channel can be even tougher. So you mentioned earlier on about getting customers in a 5-year cycle. You've got a 5-year loan agreement with a customer, and they've told you at the start what their preference for communication is, and maybe even in order, and then you retire their top 1 and 2. Well, you're not being particularly welcoming to that customer's individual channels. But with an airline, you're hoping to buy a ticket, you're hoping to fly, you're hoping to get to your destination and never think about it again. You've not got a long-term relationship. I also think whenever you have this utopia of omni-channel, somebody will invent a new channel on top of that. So when you went to what you thought was omni-channel, and it was all through the one system, it could all speak to another, someone will come up with something new, because that's the way innovation works, and you'll have a new channel that sits on top of your omni-channel, just the way life is.
Yeah, I mean, so an interesting challenge there you've got really around change management, which is, so we're all trying to change our processes, make them more efficient. You can just keep on adding to them, but it adds more complexity. If as soon as you take a step back, then you're going to get into some of the environment issues we were talking about before around not being supportive people. Is there a way of us to think about that? Because it doesn't necessarily, because sometimes we do have to make some of these changes, and we do have to take features out, as an example. I mean, how should we think about that? Or is it, that's a hard no to say, we're just going to keep on adding?
Well, I think you make a very valid point. Whenever you're adding that extra channel, you have to think about the customer's expectation of that extra channel. So if you were to use what people would perceive as instant messaging type solutions, if you can't respond to that instantly, you've mismanaged their expectation already. Now, you might think that's unfair. You would have given me 10 minutes to answer the phone. You'd have given me 24 hours to answer an email, but I've not managed to answer an instant messaging request for complex information almost immediately, and it creates a bit of friction in the process.
Yeah, yeah. So once we've got the customer on the on the phone or in engagement, we go back to a question I asked earlier, which is around, do we need to change the way we talk with customers to then gather different pieces of information? And it's quite an interesting discussion. One of the earlier panels, we're talking about how do we use this to gather information? How do we start thinking about our processes in a data manner? Does that overlay into the communications element? And how do we build that into our communications about what's the data we're capturing? And Puja, maybe have a think. What's your thoughts on that?
I think when we speak to customers or when we're engaging with them, it's very important to understand, speak to them, get insights, because that's how we understand what their mindsets are, what their behaviors are. But it's equally important to feed that and understand if we can validate that with data. So it's very important to store that information, and with data, with predictive analysis, and with AI, it's a lot easier to now take a smaller set of data and figure out if there are trends emerging from it, and what we can learn from customers, take those bigger trends and then test it. So I think it's becoming more and more important to take those learnings and feed that internally. It's not easy, it's complicated. When let's say we're creating customer personas, we've identified there are 4 or 5 personas. How do you tag each customer to that persona? How do you figure out which customer falls in which category? Because you can't really box them with 100% accuracy. There's always going to be something or the other that will come up. So we're trying to navigate that right now. We're trying to figure out how to use data and customer insights, marry them, and use them for our communications. And we're trying to drive more effectiveness with that, with tone, with channel. But it's complicated, and we're increasingly navigating that.
Yeah, but does the extra data we gather through customer engagement, does that allow us to put people in different persona buckets? Is there extra data we can gather on, say, for example, calls, to put people in different persona buckets? I mean, Rachel, what's your kind of view on that? So can the communication with the customers then provide further segmentation? Are we doing using enough of that data to further segment the customer base?
I think there's probably so much data. Sometimes we take too much data, and then we can't see which data we actually need to decide what we want to do with that. And I think there's a couple of things to lead into that. I think, the sentiment, inbound sentiment ratings, QA, and all of that stuff that you would normally use, it should be considered as part of reviewing that and how you continuously learn. I think for us at Moneyline, and if we look at things like digital communications and, the very basic data is, was it delivered? Was it opened? Did they click where you thought they would click? Did they take an action? They've been around for decades now. But actually, if you overlay on top of that something like Hotjar that says, actually, I can see where they went on my website, and did they actually go where I thought they expected them to go? And is there some missing information there that's driving communication or misunderstanding inbound and outbound for a customer? But I think for us, in terms of if it was purely human, led and on an inbound or an outbound contact strategy, we very rarely, and I think across all of the business, there's probably only one script that we have in our contact centre. The rest of it is principle driven and framework driven, which gives them the flexibility to mirror and have a really good conversation with the customer, and then understand that and then play that back into the business.
I mean, part of what we're talking about here, I suppose, is bias and sort of guarding against bias. Bias around segmentation, but also there's also bias within these AI models and using AI for decisioning. We were talking about that earlier. how do we guard against bias in customer communication, making sure that we're not giving the wrong communications to the wrong people, making sure we understand that? I mean, Dan, what's your kind of view on that? Because that's an issue with agents and humans. We're all like that as well, but it's also an issue maybe talked about more because it's safer with computers as well.
Yeah, you've got to continually monitor that model. You know, if we bring it back to Klarna, they introduced, I did some deep study recently, and it was widely publicised, so I'm able to talk about it, but they introduced a customer service chatbot in February 2024. In March 2024, it was holding 2.3 million customer communications, to which they thought that they could probably scale back some of their FTE, some of their staff, but a year later realised that the customer service had dropped. So just reiterate your question again, sorry, Chris.
How do you guard against bias? How do you guard against bias within the model?
So in that situation there, it was also publicised that potentially there was two elements to the downfall, one being that the model might not have been fully ready, or it wasn't given the right sort of communications out, which was upsetting customers. And customers was wanting to have a human person to speak to because they weren't getting the right output. So a continual monitor of the output, and also to make sure that the training data that the models that are trained on are accurate. So you've got to do a big due diligence first before you release anything like that to make sure it's fit for purpose. Secondly, you know, removing that human interaction early like that was a bit of a danger and a risk to them, because it's very muddy in the water whether the model's output was to blame or it was the reduction in headcount. So you got to just make sure that if there's anything that you're releasing to your end users, the customers, that it's fit for purpose, and it's regularly monitored. It's not just a deploy and leave, it's a regular maintenance, monitoring, making sure your data's clean and accurate and accessible, and making sure that the outputs that you're getting, you're continually monitoring them.
Yeah. I mean, Alasdair, I know you've been at the forefront of sort of looking at, you know, new technology, and I mean, how do you guard against that in terms of implementing it, making sure that it's adding value and not sort of creating harm? And what sort of protections have we got to think about? I mean, I know you think about them, but where do we need to be careful?
I think you make a very, very, very good point, and that was an excellent point around bias. I think the more that we drive consumers to self-serve, which is universally a good thing, we've got to make sure that we can still harvest those areas of vulnerable situations the customer might be in, and don't just assume because we didn't hear it in a 12-minute phone call that those same issues don't exist when the customer happens to be on the app or on the website or doing some sort of digital communication. So I think that's key, and that's sensitive because the majority of those vulnerabilities will be picked upon by our agents and explored. So they'll hear a cue that gives them the right to ask the question. So somebody may mention in their income and expenditure about prescriptions, there's a cue to be able to talk about potential medical vulnerabilities. You don't get that online. Yeah, you might get it if the customer has completed a digital I&E, and you can get some of that information, but most of the verbal cues that we get have been excluded within a digital journey. So it's how you try and make sure that you can still do that in a sensitive way when you're communicating with a group of customers who've generally got the outcome that they want. They've resolved whatever problem they've got, but you just want to make sure you understand if everything is okay. That's a sensitive one. I've heard of a couple of solutions to be able to try and do that, which are a bit more sympathetic than simply writing to someone or contacting someone and asking if everything's okay. I think for most people that would be a bit of a turn-off, but I think that's a key thing. Just because the customer is self-serve, don't assume they don't have some of those challenges that your customers who've contacted you by telephone have already highlighted.
There's a bit of an irony, isn't there, which we often look to these new channels as sort of solving problems or simplifying our processes, but in actual fact, they actually mean that we have to think about things in more detail and actually make it more complex in some ways.
Well, absolutely. You asked a question about data earlier on. We now use real-time call analytics to help our agents while they're on the telephone. So they don't get told 3 weeks after they've had a call that they didn't do something. They get told whilst they're on the telephone. And that helps eliminate some of those challenges. but it also means we can harvest significantly more information. You used to be able to have the outcome of a call, which would be a dispute or an arrangement, or the customer refuses to pay, very simple and very high level. We can now analyse the entire call and pick up multiple data points that would have been more than were practical that an agent could pick up. You wouldn't have had consistency, because some of that would be interpreted by agents differently, but you can now do that. It's how you store it, it's how you use it, it's how you use that to determine the next action, the next step, the next activity on the customer's account. Is the bit that we've not quite got to yet.
Yeah, but I suppose with that increased level of automation and identification, I mean, Rachel, I mean, how do you make sure that it goes back to, I suppose, making sure there's an opt-out, so you can always make a sensible decision from the customer's point of view? Because it's very easy to get barrow down the road and say, look, based off this and it's extra information, this is what we're going to do next. But is it the right thing? And like, how do you protect against it sort of going down one track when actually another track is actually more important?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to that continuous monitoring, isn't it? And it's not just once you've implemented something, that once it's implemented, job done, move on to the next shiny new toy. I think it's you've got to continuously monitor that, because it's continually learning. But also I think in automation is, so for us, the automation, you know, we use, this year's been a really, really aggressive roadmap for us, and we've used automation in our back office quite significantly to be able to free up our human agents to support more customers that drop out of that automation, in terms of whether that's an AI chatbot or whether that's, you know, just digital communication. So for me, I think it's just how understanding your business, understanding your customer, and then being really clear about what your user cases are, and where automation supports the user case and where it doesn't. Don't be afraid not to put it in, and keep that human journey in there.
Okay. So right at the very start of the day, we talked an awful lot about regulation, and the regulators getting increasingly involved in the sector, where it's becoming the dominant conversation, at least in the first session. How much is the regulator helping or hindering, I suppose, the use of automation? And it's like, what are the key points that are sort of out there that we've got to keep a watch for? Because I mean, certainly in the EU, we're talking about the EU AI Act. There isn't one here, but there's certainly there's data privacy. The discussion's kind of going on. The FCA's put out papers already around use of AI. I mean, how do we keep an eye on the regulatory environment, and what do we got to watch out for? I don't know if people have got thoughts on that. I mean, Puja, maybe start.
Yes, of course, we're keeping an eye out for anything the regulator is saying actively to monitor. But for us, we're a consumer, retail creditor, and we have the consumer duty outcomes that we need to adhere to. So this change was made a couple of years back, where now the regulation is more outcome focused and less process focused. So irrespective of what the process is, we have to ensure that the outcomes are favorable to the customer. There's fair value, there's customer understanding. So at least internally, what we're trying to do is, when we are adopting new technology, when we are trying to build automation and we're using AI, we're increasingly testing whether this meets those outcomes. And if it does, we internally document everything, and we have a case to say, yes, we've done the right thing because we are meeting the outcomes. And it can always lead to a conversation. But I think it's very important to, especially for someone who's doing marketing, ensuring that there's consumer understanding. So if you're testing with AI, with customer interaction, it's very important for us to know whether consumers understand it, which means there's a lot of QA, there's a lot of auditing, there's a lot of training. So it does increase complexity of our work, because we want to ensure those outcomes are being met. But if we are sure those outcomes are being met, then it's a matter of monitoring. So I do think that the regulation somewhere has room that allows for experimentation, but we need to sort of adhere to what the results are.
So it's around doing that to like end-to-end monitoring is a sort of like the backstop to them, even though you've got the implementation in between. I mean, Dan, what's your kind of view on it?
Yeah,
transparency in particular. Maybe comment on that.
Yeah, it has to be explainable. So any sort of interaction or outcome you have to be able to, as a business, explain how it got to that point. So it's not on the topic of communication, but if, say, for instance, you're going for a credit application and you're denied, that whatever technology has been used behind that, you must be able to explain clearly how that process happened and why it came to the decision it made. You mentioned there about the EU Act. They mentioned there about high risk, medium risk technologies, and there's a set process that you have to follow in order to be able to adhere to those laws. I don't think the UK's got one yet, but obviously when we do, regulation might not harm in the sense that it's going to protect businesses and it's going to protect customers and just act a bit more responsibly and ethically with the technology. Explainability in it all is vital. We must not get to the point where decisions and outcomes in conversations are, we're at a point where we can't really understand why it's come to the outcome it's made. So it's vital. Yeah. So that regulation and things like that support that journey.
I mean, Alasdair, what's your kind of view? And so it's particularly just a nuance really around sort of like vulnerability and using AI to detect vulnerability and that whole piece around transparency and then when you do it versus not and those kind of things. How do we navigate that? Because it feels like there's an opportunity to use tech to get better outcomes if we do it right.
Yes, I agree. In terms of the regulator, you wouldn't naturally expect the regulator to be at the forefront of any technology, I don't imagine, because they're bigger, slower organisations with a far wider reach than the niche that I might sit in. I think there's just shy of 30,000 FCA regulated businesses. I don't know how many are regulated to do the things that we do, but it's a niche of a niche. So I'm not sure I would expect. I absolutely pick up the point that Daniel mentioned. If you can't explain it in very simple terms, you'll always struggle to get a regulator to accept it. I remember in a previous role, being asked for, as a subprime lender, being asked for 100 calls from the FCA to do some analysis. And we said, well, actually, we've just analysed randomly 100,000 calls using real-time call analytics. That will give you a ton of insight. You're welcome to that. And they said, no, thank you. We should have 100 calls, please. And you think, one's a candle, the other one's a lighthouse. What is it you're trying to see, right? But they were comfortable at that point with 100 calls. We probably didn't do enough to try and explain to them the extra insight that they would have gained from the 100,000, and they were probably a bit suspicious about our interventions. But I think using all of the tools that you can, whether they're AI or whether they're kind of driven by a decision engine, because I think a lot of AI in our space is often just a decision tree, but that's fine. It can be applied right across a whole host of data to try and find the things that are difficult for agents to spot in amongst it, especially across a whole host of different communications. Where if you string all that communication together and put it through a different lens and say, this customer is identifying a regular amount of challenge, financial harm, spousal abuse, those sort of things will rarely come to the attention over one phone call. But if you look at that across a whole host of customer journeys using some sort of automation, some sort of AI, I think those things would come to the fore more regularly.
Do you think that's the direction to travel, Rachel, in terms of like using technology to monitor much more and to start to link things together? Particularly, I mean, we already have the regulators looking at these end-to-end customer journeys, right? So like, AI can help us knit this stuff together and come up to some of the conclusions Alasdair was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're just looking at Moneyline, if we, on average, to make a lending decision, and decision making is important when we're talking about AI and how we use that, but on average, we have access to 1,500 data points per client to make a lending decision. There is nobody in this room that could probably analyse 1,500 data points. But what AI can allow us to do in that decision making or automation is to understand how those data points and those behaviours link and can predict risk for us. And that's where I think where the revolution part of AI is in terms of a business and how we utilise it for mass data sets where we really struggle to understand that. I think going back to sort of the regulator for me, I think I agree with what you said there, Alasdair, but I do think the regulator's been really firm and strong this last year in terms of AI and where the AI framework is likely to sort of to land, but also, their collaboration, they're coming out to industry, they're really wanting to understand how they do support industry to be able to move into AI. You know, if you look at their innovation tech sprints, if you look at their sandbox programs, you know, they're pretty much investing as much as they can to create an economic value for that. And they're probably more open, you know, 2 decades in financial services. They're probably more open than they ever have been in the last couple of years, I think, in terms of understanding how businesses do make decisions, where that decision comes from and what information. The one thing I'd pick up on decision making, which is a bit of my bugbear, so I'm going to take it as an opportunity, about transparency is, you know, we make a decision, some of our decision making, not all of it, is based on a credit score. Anybody in here able to explain exactly what goes into my credit score? Because if that's not transparent, and we use that right now in our decision making, but we seem to want to overlay a lot of extra rules around AI and AI decision making, and I think we just need to reflect on, we probably couldn't explain what a credit score, how you get a credit score and what that credit score is made up of, but we make decisions on that right now, today.
Yeah, I think it's more if there's like a hallucination, or
Absolutely.
you know, like if it's made a decision that's not, you know, it had any human oversight. You look at, I think there was a case in Australia where a big consulting firm went in with the government, I think it was the government there, and did all their reporting, and it came out wrong without any human oversight. So how do you explain that those numbers and those facts and figures that they presented were wrong? I think they had to pay back like 700k in damages. So it's more about making sure that, you know, the algorithm, the model you've built is explainable. Like if you're, so for instance, like if you're making a decision there on credit, it could be multiple sources where you've gathered that information from. But if a customer says, you know, why has this been declined, then it should be explainable of, we've gone through this channel, that channel, and it's come up with this decision based on that, just so it's fair and transparent. I guess, you know, I think a lot of people talk about the hallucinations that ChatGPT can have. You know, you can ask it certain questions and it doesn't really give you the output you want, but it needs to be explainable why that is.
But that's a question of explainability rather than transparency, I think, to your point, Rachel, because it's not explainable, but the credit score example, I was actually going to ask the same question around behavioural segments, right? Which is you can do scoring and put people in different behavioural segments, but you still have false positives, even with that. So you got people who are there wrong incorrectly. You would say with on a review, but it's kind of statistically it's the right way it kind of works. So that's transparent, but it's also explainable in that case from a model point of view. Which may be
it's why it's important that, you know, decisions are made in collaboration, so augmented, so you've got human in the loop oversight, you've got that sensitivity check. You know, we can spot things that potentially, you know, even if you had something that was verifying it, might not. So that's why it's key that you see humans in the loop.
Yeah. I agree.
So, any questions from you guys out there in terms of like burning questions around communications or value communications? Send them in on TikTok, LinkedIn,
Neville Thorne,
Slido. No one's filled out the form, by the way. So it's like are we peak Slido? I think was the question we were asking. Go ahead now.
I'm just interested from the panel there how they test the value of communications and the success of communications. I'll be honest and say it's within the past 5-6 years that I've actually put something out to an independent that will go out to a marketing firm and feedback on the quality of my communications, which I thought was brilliant and turned out to be not quite so brilliant. So I just wondered how you test the customer understanding, because you articulated the business needs to explain what it's done, but how do you test the customer true understanding? You know, and we tie into the regulation, you look at annual statements, certainly in mortgages world and certain other sectors, they're confusing as hell. So how do you make sure the customer understands?
I think there are various ways to assess it. Of course, you can, one of course is engagement and behavior interactions with the communications we rolled out. You know that, of course, click rate, open rate, interactions, conversions. So are customers engaging with the communications we're rolling out or not? And if they are, where are they dropping off? So let's say, for example, we roll out a communication about the product. The customer reads it, they open it, but they don't buy it. That could be an indicator that maybe there is a lack in understanding, or maybe that our targeting is wrong. So data can give us signals, and it can indicate whether customer understanding is there or not, but then we have to then, let's say we get a signal that maybe customer understanding is low, then we roll out surveys, we roll out interviews, we roll out case studies where we are trying to talk to certain customers and understand, do they truly understand or not. Get those learnings, bake that into our new communications, and test to see, did that improve conversions? Did that improve click rate? So there are certain ways that we deploy to understand customer understanding, but it's very tricky, especially in the lending space. For example, we need to communicate the rep APR. It can be very complicated, and it can be tricky to understand. There's recently been a sandbox and experiment done by ClearScore and few, creditors. We were involved with the FCA to figure out, are customers really comprehending the product information? Again, it's all based on view data and click data, but directionally, yes, the comprehension for certain numbers is low, and even the regulator and the industry is really trying to figure out, how can we communicate the cost of credit, for example, better? So yes, consumer understanding is very important. We're constantly testing and using behavior data to understand, but speaking to customers is equally important to validate that.
Can I just add just one extra, because I totally agree with that. I think what's really interesting and what we've started to measure this year is a real clear example. So our funds released notification. So we've approved your loan, and we'll send that communication out that says, great news, your funds will be in your account within however many hours, days. We, at the beginning of this year, once we actually did a deep dive into that communication, we had a 73% response rate to that email, asking us the same information that was in that email. But when will I get my money? And how long will it take to get into my bank? That was a really clear data point that allowed us to go in and then work with some of those customers that had responded and ask them, what was it in that communication that you didn't understand that meant you... I'd love if you responded to 78% on my missed payment email. That'd be really nice. But 78%, because there's a bit of skin in the game for the customer on that, and I want to know when my money's going to land. We totally rewritten that communication, and they asked if could I have it in a text and an email, because if I get a text and I know I've got an email with some more information in, I'm probably likely to pick my text on my WhatsApp or wherever else up, and then if I want to find out a bit more, I'll go and read my email as well. So could you give me all three of those ways? And I think that's the real insight, rich stuff around valuing, how you value that customer understanding is, if they are responding to something that you believe you've already communicated, that in itself tells you that your communication's not right.
Yeah. That's quite an interesting discussion around having layers of communication of different levels of detail, or even different levels of reading age. You could have it as well, right? So people can get to it when they want to.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I think it's an interesting observation that your email, which probably contained more information than the customer really wanted, and then the text contained just what they wanted. And it's the channel you use that can determine it. If the text message could have had 10,000 characters, you might have been tempted to put 10,000 characters in. But so I think it's an interesting point. Neville, we in our world, we test that the customer understands by measuring not just all the contact range that Puja mentioned, but whether the solution that we've got for the customer is right, and they've understood the consequence of that. So we're measuring first payment rate, we're measuring third payment rate. We tend to then measure 12-month payment rate, but life will have changed likely in that time. But what we're also measuring is what the customer does, because if we've done our job correctly when we first engage with them, they've understood the outcomes that they've got if things change. So we're looking at how many people use those options, how many people use those options remotely to maybe save them the need to contact us, and that tells us they've understood the kind of stuff that we're engaging with them in the first place.
Yeah, I think on a business level, I think tying it back to a business KPI is vital. So you can start to analyse your churn and look at the communication channels or the communication styles that's led for a customer to want to leave. It's a really powerful business KPI, is understanding what customers are leaving. Was it buyer's remorse? Was it the way that they were communicated through the sales process, which has led to them not wanting to pay? So you might start to analyse that communication channel, and they might leave within the first 6 months. So if your churn is heavily linked to customers leaving in the first 6 months, you can analyse what communication channels they're having, which has led them to have a debt and ultimately not pay, or it could be later in the contract cycle with you. So linking it to a business KPI is really, really powerful, and you can start to analyse that.
It all comes back to data, doesn't it? I suppose at the end of the day. So it's
and capturing it, making sure you have that data.
Data.
Capture and use it.
Capture and use it.
So just before we finish, I mean, I was just going to go around the panel. Like, what are 3 things or 3 communication-related areas we've got to think about for 2026? Rachel, you got that. Do you want to go first? I'm going to go along left to right.
Probably 2 for me, if that's all right.
That's okay.
I'm sure the panel can add in, but I think the interesting, I think for me, is the communication. It's things like TikTok and how certain customers would probably like to be communicated by those channels, and I'm not a TikToker. I don't have a TikTok account, so I have no idea what TikTok's about. But I think we just need to understand the information that we're putting out in those channels as well, and how we can sort of help and control that. And as you said earlier, the new communications and the new shiny thing, and how we build that in. I think also, and to share this story with you, but I think human in the loop is so important, and I know it's this sort of buzzword and phrase that's been thrown around the last couple of years, but my daughter I was in the car with my daughter yesterday, and she was really nervous about a presentation that she was doing today, and she was talking to ChatGPT, and I was like, I'm sat here and I'm your mum. Why are you talking to ChatGPT about being nervous about a presentation tomorrow? And I was like, I'm the human in the car, and she was like, no, ChatGPT will just give me a good little list of how I can prepare for that and how I can calm down before I get on stage. And I think we've just got to be really cognizant of that in terms of, communication style is down to the individual. And she chose to ignore her mum. Obviously, I speak lots of rubbish, so I'll probably give the worst guidance anyway. But I think we've got to be really careful around that and recognise that.
You're actually the second or third person to say exactly that same example about ChatGPT.
Yeah, just to reiterate on that, I had a number of colleges come to us with parents very frightened with what the kids are able to do these days without any sort of real understanding. So personally myself, I think AI literacy and fluency being mandatory taught, so people are aware of the risks, the responsibilities and the opportunities that it presents. I think the more knowledgeable we are as a community and a civilization allows you to be able to speak to your daughter and say, okay, X, Y, and Z, this is why, speaking to me is important. But it's that educational piece and education in schools as well.
Yeah. Anything else for focus for 26, Dan?
For 2026, communication?
Yeah,
I
so
think
education one. And
I think it's vitally important that businesses that are looking to adopt any sort of new technology, they need to be fluent and understand what the technology is doing. And ultimately, your end user is a customer, and it's their preference. So if you can't feed someone if they're not going to eat it. So you've got to make sure that the transformation journey of an entire organisation, how do you influence 24,000 people to use something that's new? You're fundamentally disturbing the way that they're interacting and communicating, and that piece has to be done with sensitive care. So anyone that's rushing will make mistakes, and I think proper business planning, so looking at feasibility and impact. And I think if customer experience and customer satisfaction is one of your key strategic pillars as a business, and that's one of the backbones of your company, looking at the impact and feasibility across the entire strategic pillar of your business and understanding the risks and the rewards it will present before going ahead with something and jumping in too excited is vitally important. You've got to map it out properly. So strategy, risk mitigation, and understanding your business and your customers is 2026 for me.
Okay. Alasdair, what are your top 2 or 3 items?
Make it clear, make it simple, make it easy to understand, with a clear call to action for the customer.
Okay. Puja, what's your
4?
You can have mine.
Yeah, okay.
For me, I think being able to use data to quantify effectiveness of communication better is something I'd love to see being explored in 2026. Hyper-personalization. How can I understand what each customer needs based on all their data that we have, whether it's credit data, behavior data, and how can I send them communication that's completely catered to them. We might not solve that next year, but if we can come closer to a solution, that would be great.
Okay, well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much to all of the panel. Really appreciate you giving the insights. It's fantastic. So thank you very much.